In this study we're looking at keeping full of the Holy Spirit. One of the people in the New Testament who was continually described as being full of the Holy Spirit was Stephen. Stephen, you might well know, was the church's first martyr, and right to the end of his life he was described as being full of the Holy Spirit. Stephen's history begins, or at least the first time that we meet Stephen is in Acts chapter 6. The church is having a problem. There's a division between two sets of widows, the Greek Jewish widows and the Hebrew Jewish widows, if you want to describe it that way. And the dispute is over whether the food that the church is distributing is being distributed in a fair manner. And what the apostles do is they say that rather than get involved in trying to sort all this out and making sure that everybody has the correct supply of bread, they say to the church, choose out 7 people who are full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom. And one of those people happens to be Stephen, along with 6 others. And Stephen is described as being full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom. He's also described a little bit later on as being full of faith and power. And then in another place he's described as being full of God's grace and power. And Stephen begins this ministry of distributing the bread to the 2 sets of widows, and then he begins to find that he's receiving opportunities to preach the gospel and to pray for the sick and to see people set free. And before you know it, Stephen has gone from operating the Jerusalem church's food bank to being involved in signs and wonders ministry, and people are being profoundly affected by what he's doing. Of course, this draws the attention of the Jewish authorities, and they're not very happy about this because people are being converted to Christ. And eventually Stephen is put on trial and he is condemned to death. But even right at the end of his life, just before he goes to be with Jesus, he's described as being full of the Holy Spirit. I don't think there's anyone better that we can learn from in the New Testament, apart from the Lord himself, about being full of the Holy Spirit. Stephen was always continually full of the Holy Spirit. Some of us tonight might be wondering, well, how do I even get filled with the Holy Spirit, never mind staying full of the Holy Spirit? Perhaps you've never come to that place where you've had the initial filling of the Spirit. Sometimes we call that the baptism with the Holy Spirit. If that's where you find yourself, the Bible's very clear about how you can receive the baptism in the Holy Spirit. It's a promise for you. John the Baptist said that after him would come Jesus, who would baptize with the Holy Spirit and with fire. And Jesus said of himself, he said in Acts chapter 1, he said that within a short time the disciples would be baptized with the Holy Spirit. And of course we find on the day of Pentecost that all the disciples are filled with the Holy Spirit and they began to speak in other tongues. If you haven't received the baptism in the Holy Spirit, it's very, very simple. All you need to do is ask Jesus to fill you with the Holy Spirit and believe that he will. Sometimes in the New Testament people were filled when other people laid hands on them. Sometimes people were filled without anyone coming next or near them. In Acts 2 and in Acts chapter 10 we find that the disciples were filled, and in Acts chapter 10 the people in Cornelius' household were filled with the Holy Spirit without anyone laying hands on them. Yet in Acts chapter 8 and Acts chapter 19 we find that in Acts chapter 8 the apostles Peter and John laid their hands on the people, and then in Acts 19 the apostle Paul laid his hands on some of the disciples and they were filled with the Holy Spirit. So pray to God, ask him to fill you with the Spirit, and if you want to, and why don't you ask some of the people in your group to lay hands on you so that you would be filled with the Holy Spirit. The Bible also says that when we're filled with the Holy Spirit, and there's always some kind of evidence that follows that. And in the Acts of the Apostles, often the evidence was speaking in tongues. Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 10 and Acts chapter 19. The disciples spoke in tongues when they were filled with the Holy Spirit. In Acts 19 they prophesied as well. In Acts chapter 8 we're not told what happened when they were filled with the Holy Spirit, but we know that something special must have happened, because Simon the sorcerer wanted to have the same power to impart the Holy Spirit that the apostles had. So if you haven't been filled with the Holy Spirit, why not ask someone in your group to pray for you to be filled with the Holy Spirit? But we also need to have an ongoing experience of the Spirit. We need to be continually filled with the Spirit. Ephesians 5 verse 18 says, "Be filled with the Spirit, speaking to yourselves in psalms, hymns and spiritual songs." The words "be filled with the Spirit" could more accurately be translated "keep on being filled with the Spirit," or "be continually filled with the Spirit, speaking to yourselves in psalms, hymns and spiritual songs." Notice in Stephen's life that he's not just described as being full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom. In different places, Acts 6:5, and then in verse 8 again, he's described as being full of faith. He's described as being full of grace, and he's described as being full of power. There can be a growth in our experience of the Spirit. You don't need to stop with receiving a new prayer language, receiving the ability to speak in tongues and pray in tongues. God has so much more for you. He wants you to keep on being filled with the Spirit. And one of the keys to that is just keeping building yourself up. 1 Corinthians 14 verse 4 says that when we speak in tongues we edify ourselves, or we build ourselves up. And Jude 21 and 22 talks about us building up ourselves, praying in the Holy Spirit. So use your prayer language to build yourself up. And you will continue to experience more of the Spirit's power and more of the Spirit at work in your life. Continually being filled with the Spirit is also connected with praise. Again, going back to Ephesians 5 verse 18, you to speak to yourselves, or speak to one another, as some translation says, in psalms, hymns and spiritual songs. Where there's praise, the Holy Spirit is welcome. And where there's the Holy Spirit, there'll always be praise. So keep praising God, keep thanking God, and keep using your prayer language. And then, of course, in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 12, it also says that we're to seek to excel in the gifts that build up the church. Sometimes you just need to have a go. You need to step out in faith. You need to share what you believe God has given you. And even if you're not sure whether it's from God or not, submit it to your group, and who knows, you might be surprised at what God does through the word that you bring. So I pray that as you spend time studying the life of Stephen, that you'll have a fresh passion, a fresh desire for the Holy Spirit. And I pray too, that you'll begin to develop the conviction and the confidence that it's God's will not just to fill you now, but to keep on filling you. In fact, to keep on filling you right to the very end of your life.